I built the risk management framework from scratch. Not inherited it, not improved someone else's work. Built it from nothing, 17 years ago when the bank had 3 branches and the loan portfolio that fit in a single binder. I designed the credit review process. I wrote the internal audit protocols. I trained every loan officer who came through that institution on what concentration risk actually means. Not the textbook definition, but the kind that quietly accumulates until a regulator asks you to explain why 40% of your commercial book sits in one sector and you have no good answer. My name is not important. What I did for Cascade Valley Bank is, I was the chief risk officer. Had been for 11 years by the time the new CEO walked in. Before that, I was deputy CRO. Before that, senior credit analyst. I came up through that institution the way people used to come up through institutions. Slowly, methodically, learning every layer before moving to the next one. I knew where everybody was buried, figuratively speaking. I knew which branch manager had a habit of rounding up appraisal values. I knew which commercial relationship had been grandfathered through credit exceptions 3 cycles in a row. I knew all of it because my job was to know all of it, and I took that job seriously in a way that, apparently, not everyone appreciated. The board brought in the new CEO after our longtime president retired. His name was the kind of name that looked good in press releases. He came from a private equity background, which should have been the first sign. Private equity people see banks the way some people see old houses, as assets to be repositioned, not as institutions with regulatory obligations that don't bend because you have a growth thesis. His name was Garrett. Just Garrett. He introduced himself that way in the all-staff meeting. No last name, like he was a brand. I sat in the second row of that meeting and watched him talk about unlocking value and accelerating the balance sheet. And I thought about the 9 open examination findings we had with the OCC. None of them critical, all of them manageable, all of them requiring exactly the kind of sustained attention that tends to get deprioritized when new leadership arrives with new priorities. He shook my hand afterward. He said he'd heard great things. He said he was looking forward to working with me. I smiled and said the same. That was 8 months before everything fell apart. The first time was when he started bringing his brother-in-law to strategy meetings. His brother-in-law's name was Felix. Felix had spent the previous decade working in commercial real estate in Phoenix. Before that, something in wealth management. He was the kind of person who used the word synergies without irony and asked questions in meetings that revealed he did not understand the difference between a bank's loan-to-deposit ratio and its efficiency ratio, but asked them with such confidence that people who didn't know better might have thought the confusion was everyone else's problem. I noticed it. I kept my mouth shut. Then Garrett started including Felix in conversations about our strategic plan. Then Felix started sitting in on my quarterly risk committee presentations. Then one afternoon in March, Garrett called me into his office and told me he was creating a new role, Chief Strategy and Risk Officer, that would consolidate strategic planning and risk oversight, and that he'd like Felix to step into it. He said it the way people say things when they've already decided and are now performing the conversation. I asked what would happen to my current responsibilities. He said I would have an important role supporting the transition. He used the word consulting twice. He said my institutional knowledge was invaluable. He looked at the window while he said it. I sat with that for a moment. 17 years. The stress testing models I'd built before stress testing was a regulatory requirement. The CECL implementation I had managed personally, working 18-hour days for 4 months to get it right. The credit concentrations I had flagged in 2019, that, had anyone ignored them, would have put us in front of a consent order by 2021. I thought about all of that and I said, very quietly, that I appreciated him telling me directly and that I would need some time to think about what made sense for me going forward. He seemed relieved. He probably thought I was going to make it difficult. I wasn't going to make it difficult, but I also wasn't going to stay. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I've heard the story told with details that aren't accurate, and the accurate version is more instructive. I did not go to the regulators. I did not call anyone. I did not leave a folder of problems on Felix's desk with a note attached. I resigned, gave my 4 weeks notice, conducted a thorough transition documentation process, answered every question Felix asked me during those 4 weeks with complete accuracy and professional courtesy, and left. I left on a Friday afternoon in April. I shook hands with people I had worked with for a decade. I took my desk plant and my framed photo and I walked out to my car and I sat there for about 10 minutes before I drove home. That was it. What happened after that was not something I engineered. It was something that was always going to happen, because you cannot put someone into a chief risk officer role who does not understand risk management and expect the institution to function as though it has a qualified CRO. Regulatory frameworks do not adjust themselves to accommodate internal org chart decisions. The OCC does not grade on a curve because you're going through a leadership transition. Here is what I knew that Garrett apparently did not. We were 18 months into a bank acquisition target relationship with a regional holding company called Alderton Financial Group. The deal was structured as a cash and stock transaction, valued at approximately $58 million. The regulatory approval process for a deal that size runs through the OCC and the Federal Reserve, and one of the things both agencies look hard for, as in, it is literally a checklist item, is evidence that the acquired institution has a functioning risk management infrastructure led by qualified personnel. I had been the person who would sit across from the examination team and answer questions about our DFAST methodology, our internal audit function, our credit review independence, our model risk governance. I had been doing that for 11 years. Felix had been doing commercial real estate in Phoenix. Our OCC examination was scheduled for July. I knew this because I'd been coordinating with the examination team for 4 months before I resigned. I handed off all of my coordination notes to Felix during the transition. I answered every question he had. He had a lot of questions that suggested he was still trying to understand the basic vocabulary. I wished him well. I meant it, actually. It was not his fault his brother-in-law put him in a position he wasn't equipped for. I spent the first month after leaving doing very little. I slept more than I had in years. I took walks in the morning. My wife, who had watched me run on stress and adrenaline for the better part of a decade, made me eat breakfast before noon every day. I had conversations with a few former colleagues who checked in. They told me Felix was asking the risk committee to slow down on some of the remediation work on the open examination findings, the ones I'd been managing, because he wanted to restructure how they were being tracked. They told me he had canceled the standing weekly meeting with our external audit firm and said he would reschedule when he had time to review the scope. I listened. I didn't say much. That was their institution to run now. In June, I got a call from a woman at a consulting firm who had heard through the industry that I was available. She wanted to know if I'd be interested in interim CRO work at a community bank in Oregon going through a leadership transition of their own. We talked for an hour. She said she'd follow up in 2 weeks. That was where I was when the OCC examination team arrived at Cascade Valley Bank in July. The examination did not go well. I know this not because I was there, but because the industry is smaller than people think. And when an OCC examination results in a matters requiring attention count that doubles from the prior cycle, people talk, from what I understand. And I am being careful with what I say because I only know what I was told secondhand. The examination team had significant concerns about the risk management function. The model risk governance documentation Felix had submitted was incomplete. The credit concentration monitoring process had a gap in it that I had flagged as a remediation item before I left and which had not been closed. The examination team asked about the qualifications of the chief strategy and risk officer and reviewed his background, and then they asked to meet with the board's risk committee, which is not a routine request. The Federal Reserve also made an inquiry. I found this out later. The acquisition approval process requires both agencies to sign off. And when the OCC flags concerns about risk management governance at an acquired institution, the Fed takes notice. In September, I received a call from a former board member at Cascade Valley, someone I had worked with for years, someone who had voted against Felix's appointment but been overruled. She called to tell me that the Alderton deal had been placed on regulatory hold, not canceled, not officially dead, but suspended pending resolution of the examination findings. She asked me how I was doing. I told her I was fine. She asked if I had found something new yet. I told her I was in conversations with a consulting firm. She said she wished the board had handled things differently. I told her I appreciated that. We stayed on the phone for a few minutes without saying much. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a while. My wife asked if everything was okay. I told her what had happened. She said very quietly that she wasn't surprised. I wasn't either. The Alderton deal did not close that year. The regulatory hold extended into the fourth quarter, and then the board, responding to pressure from the major shareholders who had been counting on the acquisition premium, voted to remove Garrett from the CEO role. The announcement used language about strategic realignment and mutual agreement. It always does. Felix left at the same time. The institution hired an interim CRO from an advisory firm while they conducted a search for permanent leadership. The new permanent CRO, when they finally hired one, was a woman who had spent 15 years at a larger regional bank in the Pacific Northwest. She had an advanced degree in financial risk management. She had managed a team through a full examination cycle with 0 matters requiring attention. I know because I met her once. Briefly, at an industry conference 6 months later. We shook hands. She knew who I was. She said the documentation package I had left during my transition had been genuinely useful, that there were notes in it her team had been grateful for. I thanked her. I told her the institution deserved someone who was going to take care of it. I meant that in the most literal sense, not as a dig, not as a way of reminding anyone of anything. I meant that the bank had good people in it, had served its communities for decades, and deserved leadership that understood what it was holding. The Alderton deal eventually closed, but not in the form it had originally been structured, and not at the same valuation. The regulatory process added costs and delays that eroded the deal economics considerably. Shareholders who had been expecting a particular outcome received something different. I tell this story not because I want credit for what happened. I didn't cause it. I caused nothing. I resigned. I documented my work. I answered questions during my transition. I left. What followed was the result of decisions made by people who believed that expertise is interchangeable, that a title transfers the knowledge attached to it, that you can replace someone who spent 17 years building institutional knowledge with someone who spent 10 years in commercial real estate and the thing you build will keep working. It doesn't work that way. It has never worked that way. There is a particular arrogance in that assumption, that the machine runs itself, that the person who understood it was just a warm body occupying a seat, that fresh thinking means untested thinking, that loyalty to a family member is a reasonable substitute for competency in a federally regulated financial institution. I have watched this happen more than once in my career, in different forms, at different institutions, with different names attached to the roles. It tends to end the same way. The thing that institutional knowledge actually is, and I have spent a lot of time thinking about how to explain this to people who haven't lived inside it, is not information. It's not facts in a binder or notes in a folder. It's the understanding of what is load-bearing, which processes exist because someone thought they would be nice to have, and which processes exist because without them the whole structure fails a regulatory examination. Those are not the same category of process, and they are not labeled differently, and the only way you know the difference is by having been there long enough to understand why each one was built. Felix didn't know the difference. He had no way of knowing. It wasn't a moral failing. It was a structural impossibility. Garrett should have known better. He was running a federally chartered bank. The regulations are not hidden. The consequences for failing to maintain qualified risk management leadership are documented in guidance that is publicly available and that any CEO of a regulated institution should have read before making personnel decisions of that magnitude. He chose not to apply that knowledge, or perhaps he never acquired it. Either way, the outcome was the same. I am working now. The interim role in Oregon became a permanent one, and the institution there is healthy and well run, and has people in it who understand what they are doing and why they are doing it. I go home at a reasonable hour most evenings. I eat breakfast before noon. I think sometimes about that Friday afternoon in April when I sat in my car in the parking lot for 10 minutes before driving home. I was not angry exactly. I was something closer to resigned, in the non-resignation sense, settled into the knowledge that some things are going to happen the way they are going to happen. And your job is to decide what your role in it will be. My role was to leave cleanly, to document everything, to answer every question asked of me during those 4 weeks, to not call anyone, to not leave anything on anyone's desk, to walk out, drive home, and let the institution figure out what it had. They figured it out. It cost them considerably to do so. That is not a satisfying ending in the way that movies make endings satisfying. There was no moment in a boardroom. There was no phone call where I found out and felt a clean rush of vindication. There was a call from a former board member who told me a deal had been placed on hold, and I sat at my kitchen table afterward, and my wife asked if I was okay. But it is an honest ending. And in my experience, honest endings are the only ones that actually stick. The institution knows now what it had. Whether they will remember that the next time someone arrives with fresh thinking and a family member to place, that I cannot say. What I can say is that I do not carry any of it with me. I documented my work. I left with my integrity intact. I built something good. And for 17 years it functioned the way I built it to function. And when I left, the evidence of what I had built spoke for itself. That is enough. That has always been enough. I think about Felix sometimes, not with bitterness, that passed a long time ago, but with something closer to clarity. He was put in a position that was designed to fail him. He didn't ask for it, not really. Garrett handed him a title that carried obligations Felix had no way of understanding, and then expected the institution to keep running as though nothing had changed. That is not Felix's failure. That is a failure of judgment at the top. And judgment at the top carries consequences that spread far wider than the person who made the call. What I've come to understand about this whole episode is that it illustrates something I've watched play out more than once across my career, in different rooms, with different names. There is a kind of intelligence that shows up on paper. Credentials, titles, connections, confidence. And there is a different kind that only comes from doing the actual work over a long period of time and being accountable for it. Garrett had the first kind. He mistook it for the second. That mistake cost the institution considerably. I am not a person who believes in luck, good or bad. What happened to Cascade Valley Bank after I left was not bad luck. It was cause and effect, operating exactly the way cause and effect operates in federally regulated environments. You remove the person who understands the load-bearing structures. The structure reveals what was actually holding it up. The examination team arrives with questions. The questions don't get answered well. The consequences follow. This is not complicated. It is also not punitive. It is simply how systems work when they are built on the premise that compliance is not optional. The thing I'm most at peace with is how I left. I documented everything. I answered every question during those 4 weeks. I did not make it difficult, did not call anyone, did not leave anything behind that was designed to cause problems. I left the way I would want someone to leave if the situation were reversed. Cleanly, professionally, with the institution's interests considered even when the institution had not particularly considered mine. That took something from me that I had to build deliberately, over years. It takes a certain kind of discipline to separate your ego from your response to being wronged. It takes intellectual honesty to acknowledge that your value should speak for itself, and that defending it loudly usually diminishes it. And it takes a steadiness, a willingness to stay with your own principles when the easier thing would be to burn something down on your way out. That doesn't come naturally to most people, myself included on the hardest days. I sat in my car in that parking lot for 10 minutes. I won't pretend I was entirely at peace in those 10 minutes. I was human about it. But I drove home. I let it go. I let the work I had done speak for itself. And it did. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that felt like vindication in the moment. In a quiet, methodical way. The way good work always eventually speaks. The examination findings mounted. The acquisition stalled. The board acted. The institution found its way back toward stability, slowly, at considerable cost. I was in Oregon by then, doing the work again, building something again, accountable again. That is where I belong. That is where anyone who takes their craft seriously belongs. In the work, not in the aftermath of someone else's bad decision. What I would tell anyone in a similar position is simply this. Do your job with integrity while you have it. Leave with your reputation intact when you don't, and trust that the systems you built will reveal their value on their own timeline. You don't need to announce what you know. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Build well. Leave clean. The rest takes care of itself.